Hey everybody, before we get into the podcast, I need your help. I want to make this podcast something that serves you by being a resource for you, but I need your help to do this. I'm conducting a short 10-question survey and I need your input. It'll only take you a few minutes. So just go to the show notes for this episode, episode number 28, and click on the link there for the survey. It'll be 10 questions that will help me to help you. The survey will be available June 15th through 30th, 2015. So if you're listening to this podcast in, say, 2027, you're too late. You're not going to be able to help. Now, for the rest of you who are listening sometime in June, between June 15 and June 30, 2015, what are you waiting for? Go take the survey. Have you done it yet? Go for it. Now, back to our regularly scheduled program. You're listening to All In. This is the podcast dedicated to helping you fulfill the mission of God in your life and around the world. I'm your host, Jeff Ruger. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us in this week's episode of All In. Sure do appreciate you joining with me in this journey of fulfilling the mission of God. Hey, I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher or whatever is your favorite podcatcher. And if this is helpful for you, share it with your friends and family on Facebook or Twitter or heck, even MySpace if that's still out there. But this week, I have the special privilege of having Marc and Kathy Shaw with me on this week's show. Marc and Kathy are Foursquare missionaries being deployed to Vienna, Austria. They are church planters, having planted churches in both the United States and in Germany. They've served as missionaries in Europe, and they're my former boss. That's right. 20 years ago when I started working in Russia, Marc and Kathy were the regional coordinators for Foursquare Europe, which is what we used to call the job that I presently have as an area missionary. So he was my boss. In 2004, they returned to the United States, and now here, you never do math on a podcast live or anything else. Here, 11 years later, they are heading back to the mission field to plant a church and help cultivate leaders and make disciples in Vienna. Marc and Kathy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeff.
It's so good to be able to have some time with you guys. Just have a tremendous amount of love and respect for both of you.
Yeah, and by the way, on the front end, just want to say thanks for the tons of help that you've been in helping us navigate this process of returning to Europe and working with FMI, especially through the new kind of setup where before we went as basically employees and now raising our own funds, and it's kind of a whole new animal, and you've really, really helped us navigate that, especially as it relates to having to be sensitive to not only the new process, but everyone involved, Europeans, Foursquare Europe, Executive Council, Austrian leaders, and Foursquare Missions International. So thank you so much.
You bet. It's my privilege. There's a lot. It's amazing the complexity of what you have to deal with in doing this kind of work that you and I are engaged in. My first question, Marc and Kathy, at this stage of life, when most people are thinking about slowing down, settling down, here you guys are ramping it up again, and you're getting ready to start what could be a 10-year, if not longer, intense process of planting churches and developing leaders. And so my first question to you is, what gives? What were you thinking?
Well, I think it starts just kind of with the mentality of how do you retire from Jesus? How do you someone who's given life to you forever? And, joke about when we lived in Germany, got fairly close to Reinhard Bonnke, the great evangelist, and was talking to him about a guy in our church one time who was having a midlife crisis, was ministering to him, and Bonnke said, when you live forever, it's hard to find the middle point. So, midlife crisis is really difficult to have when you're thinking with an eternal perspective. And when we signed up, we just signed up for life, and we'll just spend our lives doing whatever the Lord calls us to do to share His love and help people understand that there's this wonderful God who loves them and will forgive them and give them new life if they'll turn to Him. And so that's a lifetime commitment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I don't think, Jeff, that I think the older you are in the Lord, and Marc and I will be married this month, 43 years, and I met Christ 45 years ago as a 20-year-old. And I think in these years, the amount of circumstances that you've been through with the Lord, places that you've been tested, constantly being changed by Him, and places where you found Him to be faithful. I think there is an incredible amount of understanding more who He is and more who you are in Him. And I think you realize at this stage of the game that it really is all Him. It always was, but Marc used to say, you know, we run around often in our own steam and thinking that we have to work for the Lord, and really in the end all you do is sweat a lot. That you just realize whatever happens, whatever produced or what changes, or it just all comes from Him. It's amazing. So I know that our energy levels aren't what they were when we were 30, of course, and yet you know that when the Holy Spirit moves, He's the one who does it anyway. So I think I've come down to the bottom line is you just make yourself available. And we know that obedience is better than sacrifice. And when in our lives we have sensed God stirring our hearts, moving us in a certain direction, we know that He will provide. You know, if we just obey and we show up, God will make it happen. So,
and I love that old story too, Jeff, of the little boy who asks his grandpa, says, "Grandpa, can you see God?" And a tear forms in the grandpa's eye and drips down his cheek, and he says, "It seems like that's all I can see anymore." And so there's a settledness. You know, at one point where there was this kind of youthful and sometimes naive, enthusiastic energy that was involved in serving the Lord. There's certainly still an excitement and a joy, but it's more settled in realizing, being so confident in who He is with lots of experience and seeing Him being faithful in so many ways. So it really kind of carries that. I like the story of, when Michael Jordan took a break from basketball to play baseball, and he came back and he's kind of rusty. But he also was a little older, so he didn't have the speed to beat the younger guys to the basket as much as he did before. So he changed his game up and developed a really killer fall-away jumper. So you have to adjust your game a little bit, but you can still score points, and so that's exciting.
Yeah, and that's an exciting thing to see with you guys, and because you see so many people. They think, well, my best years are behind me, or my best years are ahead of me. Your best years are the one that you're in. And
that's really true.
As you're just embrace where you are and don't limit God. It is great though, as we all have grown wiser and gotten a little older. I was talking with somebody last week about this. I said, when we were all younger, it was like, hey, I want to lead. I want to be the one running and doing it, blah, blah, blah. I go, you get to a point now where it doesn't bother you to look at somebody else and say, why don't you lead this? You take it, because you have nothing left to prove anymore.
That's right.
And it's a great stage.
Wings wear out.
Yeah. It's a
head goose's wings wear out, and so you take the point for a while.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm happy to be on the team, but you take the current.
Yeah, and I see people now. I'm thinking of pastors or key leaders that may be sensing a transition in their life, and they ought to consider doing something bold and crazy like this. Say, hey, there are people out there on the field that need my help, my wisdom. That's something that I've actually, and you know this yourself, Marc, because you've been where I'm at now. Leaders who what they need are fathers. So much of the type of leader that we work with They were first generation believers. Nobody taught them anything. They've kind of made it up as they've gone along, and they love to have somebody that's got a little bit of experience under their belt and some years under their behind them, and saying, we've got the experience and we have nothing else we have nothing to prove. We're just here to serve. And that would be a great opportunity for a lot of people. Now, hey, I'd like to go back a little bit and kind of unpack your story. Tell me about how you came to know Jesus, how you and Kathy met each other, just kind of that formative stage of your life. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, Kathy and I met in, I think, 1970 in a church that was pastored by the man who led me to the Lord. He didn't lead me to the Lord in that church. He led me to the Lord in my hometown because he'd been invited up to speak to a group of young people who were just hungry to know about God. And he shared with us the gospel in a way that I had never heard it before, just the simplicity of what Christ did for us on the cross, the power of his love and his blood to forgive us of all of our sins, to change our lives. And many of us were baptized, filled with the Holy Spirit on that same night. I was 17 years old, and it transformed my life forever. I went to Bible college in Seattle following that for 1 year, but then returned to this town near my hometown, Wenatchee, Washington, where he and his wife were a pastor, and lived with them in their home, received personal discipleship, and eventually went on staff as a youth pastor, then an evangelist / associate pastor, missionary, did a lot of missions work out of that church. And so we just really were inculcated into this sense of revival. It was during the Jesus People movement, the charismatic awakening, all that hit at the same time, and there was this incredible fire. We saw thousands and thousands of young people come to Christ around the state of Washington, up and down the West Coast, and then in Europe as well. And so this church really carried that sense of mission and fire for the Lord, reaches many people with this message. Every man, woman, and child has the right to hear about God's love and forgiveness through Jesus Christ. So that was deep in our spiritual DNA. And I met Kathy in that church probably about a year after I started going there.
Mm-hmm. I think I came to Christ in August of 1970. And I'd gone to a year of college. Had a broken family. My mom and dad had divorced when I was 18 and was kind of on my own in my hometown, Wenatchee, Washington. And I think it's true for a lot of people in that generation who they're out of that generation. You'll find a lot of pastors now in the late 60s, early 70s who were involved in those years of really searching for something more, not knowing what that is, but I'm sure deep down inside we were God seekers and just didn't know it. And but we knew there must be more to this life than what we saw. Mm-hmm. And great upheaval in those years in our culture. And I had a friend in Seattle who'd moved back to Wenatchee and who'd given her life to Christ in the county jail because she had been selling drugs, and I wasn't aware of it even. She never did it in front of me, but was busted in the town and ended up in county jail, gave her life to Christ. And when I ran into her after living in Seattle for a number of months, went back to my hometown, she told me what had happened in her life. And at the time, it was just the timing of the Lord, where I was really open to listen, because I had many friends come before her who told me about what happened in their lives. And I always thought, well, that's great for you, but that's not really for me. Didn't come out of a church background, really wasn't interested in church. But when she ran into me, I was at a place where I tried everything I knew to change and nothing worked. And so I thought, why not? And so I was actually in a service where there was a call to receive Christ, and made that decision. And I knew immediately when I prayed with her to receive the Lord that there had been a transformation happen in me.
Didn't you say you kind of went to that service ready to give your life to the
Yeah.
Lord.
Yeah.
And you didn't really, he said during the sermon, you just couldn't wait till it was over so you could go forward
Right,
and
it
pray.
was my time to pray and,
Yeah.
and receive the Lord. And I was also, right when I received Christ, she said, "Would you like to be baptized in the Holy Spirit?" And I said, "What's that?" And she just explained in a few sentences what that was. And I said, "Well, if it's from God, I want it." And so I was baptized immediately afterwards and received the baptism with the evidence of speaking in tongues. And and then a week later, I work. And so although relationships, of course, make a life a little more difficult, because your focus isn't necessarily just on Jesus and what's happened in your life, but you got some emotional things going on. But at the same time, God in His grace knew, and knew where we were at and what we needed. And it was an amazing journey. And I think in those years, we just became family, so close, a lot of young people, and had fantastic pastors who loved God and who were so different from us. We were the holes in the jeans, and we didn't buy them that way, we got them that way. And our pastor wore, white patent leather shoes and Nehru jackets and polyester suits, and we did not relate to that at all.
And a bouffant, Pentecostal bouffant.
But we related to the love of God,
Yeah.
and we saw that in His eyes, and so amazing beginning.
That's great, and I know the impact of that man and a number of churches and leaders that, like yourself, that was birthed out of that church was quite amazing. Some that are dear friends of mine to this day that I've gotten to know, and it's been amazing to watch how the lines are tied back to what God was doing there in Wenatchee back then.
Yeah.
Now, how did God call you guys into the ministry?
Well, the night that I received Christ, I had really been a searcher too. It was the 60s. Jimi Hendrix said, "Are you experienced?" And I said, "No, but I want to be." So I got really experienced, only in the wrong direction. And when Jesus filled my heart, and I just sensed this overpowering love, and that very night, I just said, "God, I'll go anywhere you want me to go and share this love with anyone you." I thought in my mind, even India, because that's got to be like the most difficult place you could. There's horror stories you'd hear about that country, and that's got to be the most difficult place you could possibly go. So I just said, "My life is yours, and whatever you want me to do, wherever you want me to go." So somehow that heart was really in it. That summer, during these home meetings that we had, we'd hear all kinds of stories about people bringing the gospel and mission stories. And again, our pastor had this heart to really not only preach but live the great commandment: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And then also the great commission: go into all the world. And he not only preached it, he led the way in it. And during this youth revival, like I said, there were just hundreds and hundreds of kids that came to the Lord in our church, and we had about 120 kids in our youth choir. So it was a real full-on youth choir, and we had a Jesus rock band, and we had a trio, kind of a Crosby, Stills, Nash oriented trio, and I was in all three of those, and so we did a lot of musical evangelism, and just wherever we could get, we could get into parks, we could get into schools, we would do special assemblies in schools. Principals would have us come in. We'd give our testimony. We could actually do altar calls in schools back in those days. We'd see tons of high school, junior high kids come to Christ, and then travel overseas. We had this invitation from Youth with a Mission to come help them with the Olympics in 1972 in Munich. That was our first big overseas ministry mission, and we were there for 5 or 6 weeks in Europe, including Denmark and different places in Germany. And we met all kinds of German leaders, and they loved our choir and would ask us to sing and give testimonies, and they would preach, especially this one fire evangelist from Berlin. But we were in Munich for 3 weeks, and we saw miracle after miracle after miracle, and that's where the bug really hit me. I just wanted to stay. Kathy and I had been married for about 1 month or 2 months, and And she said, "Okay, have a good time. I'll be back in Wenatchee." So, I mean, my heart was to stay there. We used to take, then after that, we were invited by Germans in Europe, different Europeans, to come back almost on an annual basis or a semi-annual basis and do ministry and help. And then in 1977, Kathy and I were invited by this one fire evangelist from Berlin that I mentioned to come serve and work and help him in his church in Berlin. And that ended up being a year experience. So that was our first missions move to Europe, was 1977. This was when Berlin was behind the Iron Curtain. So that was a really interesting experience to actually be in Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain and doing traveling ministry into Eastern Europe, into East Berlin, East Germany, and also taking trips into Hungary, smuggling Bibles and Christian literature. And so the bug was strong, and it just never left. We were there. That was our first missions trip, 1977. We moved back. We were back in the United States, did some church planting, and then continued our ministry in Europe. Foursquare Missions heard about our work there and basically recruited us to go help what was going on in Germany and Central Europe at the time. There weren't very many churches. Our first request was to be kind of an area missionary, and we thought, there's not a lot to really oversee at this point. Why don't you let us just plant a church and develop leaders? And they let us do that and said yes. And so we came under the German leadership at the time, and God just really blessed it. And it just was very, very fruitful. We're so blessed to have been able to just be a part of all of that.
And I think, too, I can add, when we came to Christ, I don't think it was like, you didn't think a lot about, there's the lay person and there's a full-time paid pastor. I mean, of course, there was a dichotomy there as far as respect and
function.
Yeah, but it was like the Holy Spirit lives in you, and He is calling you to be the one to tell others about the love of God and about what Christ has done for you. So I think we started out that way, that it wasn't like God calls, of course, special people, but everyone is special and has given every one of us the responsibility of telling what we know. And I think that was instilled in the very beginning. And I mean, the people who, the woman who led me to Christ, she didn't have any official position. She was a believer who'd been touched by the love of God and then felt the responsibility to tell me as a friend what had happened into her life. And it kind of reminds me of the Decker couple, John and Sonia Decker, who do a lot of teaching now and throughout Foursquare in the world and do what Jesus did. And I think, kind of bringing back the understanding of everyone can lead people to Christ. Everyone can lead people to the gift of the Holy Spirit. But that for us was a given, that we were all capable of doing that and were called by God to do that. But I think when I met Marc, I realized, which of course, as I mentioned, it was only a week after I came to Christ, but as I got to know him, I knew from the very beginning that he really loved God, and he would always love God more than me. I would come second place to him, and I knew that was okay. It was right that way. And I would never be competing with God in that way, but have a special place in his heart. And that was exciting to me. To know that. I remember when he was first a believer, he was going to Bible school, but he was also already teaching Bible and having home groups. So he kind of hit the ground running. And I knew if I latched onto him that we would have an exciting ride. But also at the same time, sometimes when he talks about the different times that he wanted to stay in Europe and I wanted to go home, or I didn't want to go. I really believe that God partners us together with people who balance us out. And just as he was a crazy man, and was willing to go and do anything for God, I would be the one to balance it out and say, you haven't thought about this. This is the outcome of that if we do that. And so it's been a good mix. And interestingly enough, now that we're in this position,
this new call back to Europe.
Yeah, I think I think it's interesting that God began the work in my heart, but he needed to, because I had mentioned to Marc that
the roles were a little bit reversed.
Yeah, they
You were all
were.
set to go.
Yeah, and we can cover that a little bit later. I think has a lot to do with my role in the past of having 3 sons in the home and raising 3 sons, and now having them have their own families. And it is time when you can be free to be released to do something else.
Yeah, that's great. It's wonderful how God seems to pair us with someone who's going to help keep us balanced and moving.
Yeah.
I know Debbie has been that so much for me. Now, Marc and Kathy, you went to Munich 1972, and then you came back.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere in there, you planted a church over in Ephrata, correct?
Right. Yeah, this is the town I was born and raised in, where I came to Christ as a 17-year-old. Yeah.
Okay. Now, is that the church where Rory is now pastoring?
Rory Llewellyn. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hey, good shout out there to Rory. Keep it up.
Yeah,
Man. You're doing a good
Roy.
job.
He's a great guy.
Yeah.
And he is one of the first pastors that was interested in talking to us about what God is doing in our lives now, and wanted to support that.
That's wonderful.
So that's fantastic. And that was 1979 that we planted that church.
Wow. So Marc and Kathy,
Right.
you'd been serving in Europe up until 2004. Area missionaries, or regional coordinator, it was called back then. And then, what triggered this return back to the United States? God must have stirred something in your heart. What was that?
Okay. Yeah, let me just give a preliminary thing on that. We began to sense that the Lord was stirring, that there was a transition. After having transitioned a number of times and being careful and praying them through, you can kind of sense when God's doing that. So we knew something was happening, and we processed that a little bit together and began praying about what possibilities. And interestingly enough, one of the options that we were considering and praying about was going to plant a church in Vienna. I mean, it was hotter in my heart than it was Kathy's, but Kathy really kind of is the one who sensed what was going on, and again, through prayer and her sensitivity to the Spirit, helped lead the way on that transition. So why don't you share on that?
Yeah, I would say, and even as I share this, we don't see everything from our own perspective, and that's why we need each other to get the whole truth or the whole picture. So I can only share from my perspective, and it's not the whole picture. But I think at the time, Marc had said yes to the question from Foursquare leadership to take the responsibility in Europe of being the supervisor. And I think at that point in time, I mean, he never does anything a little. He does it 150% and gives everything he has, because that's the kind of guy he is. But I think he would also say, as he saw a great need, he pretty much didn't take real good care of himself. And I think it's very important that we as leaders in these years also have the responsibility to be very upfront and honest about who we are and the mistakes that we've made, and never forget that as long as we live on this earth, we're flesh and spirit, and we have to deal with the human side of us and know that we have limitations, and we're not gods yet. Not totally spirit yet. And I just began to see it just kept growing. Foursquare Europe kept growing under his leadership, and there were more and more countries to serve and to go to and help out. He could be, writing bylaws in one country 1 week, sitting in a hotel, and then 2 weeks later he could be in a conference in Spain, and then the next week in Greece, doing leadership development. I mean, it was a really a lot. And especially at that point in time, it was very difficult to get others to come help in that leadership. And it didn't happen. And so I personally, and a very wonderful friend who worked with Marc as an assistant, and our middle son who helped Marc in the office there, just began to see signs of burnout, that he was at capacity, and it was time to do something. So actually, honestly, I prayed because I saw it. But of course, men of that personality and the leadership potential and the responsibilities that they have, their hearts are really to help and to do right by the people that they serve, began to pray and ask the Lord to call him. And I thought at the time, to be able to get him back to the States would be good for him, would be good for us.
Mm-hmm. She started asking questions like, when we move back to the United States, where do you think you would like to go?
And he had no inkling, no idea. So 2 weeks later, we got a call from Ron Swore, who was at the time the supervisor in Oregon, and the rest is history. So it was a very difficult decision to move back to the States, and I knew that the love that God had planted in both of our hearts for our European friends would not leave, and it was a very tearing, just a very difficult decision to make, but it was right.
Now, while you were stateside for these 11 years, you had some health problems pop up. Marc did, and would you like to talk about that? Not so that we can disgorge the whole process of what happened, but ultimately to get to the fact of God was so faithful even through that entire transition, that 10-year period of everything you guys went through, that God ultimately, how he demonstrates his faithfulness. Would you like to unpack that a little bit for me?
Well, yeah, Kathy mentioned especially those last 5 years of doing so much traveling in Europe. There were 30 different countries that we were working in, and I visited a lot of those two times a year. So traveling constantly and not watching my boundaries and not observing Sabbath as we are commanded to do for the reasons of not only spiritual health but physical health. And so I was experiencing a classical burnout and didn't know it until I got back to the United States and was pastoring this church. And then it kind of began to really hit in full force. And what I didn't know is that was also exacerbated by the fact that I had an advanced and rapidly growing prostate cancer. Prostate cancer feeds off of testosterone, which is also a male hormone that gives you drive and energy and, in all kinds of areas. And so I was over-depleted in adrenaline, over-depleted in serotonin, and in testosterone. So I was really having a difficult time engaging, being energetic, engaging with people, and doing my job well. I really didn't pastor that church very well. We thought we could remedy it, and we did to a certain extent, but when we began to see trigger signs happen again, we just thought, this is time to resign this church until I know that I'm completely healed up. And at the end of that time, Kathy said, well, now that we've decided to resign this church, get a full physical. So we got a full physical, and they did this prostate cancer at the time. And so they said, yeah, we're going to have to get you in quick. It was just a couple of months later that we went in for surgery, and the type of a process that I had was robotic, but it also included removing a number of things, and then a thing called Lupron treatment, which is the shutdown of all male hormones for probably it lasted over a year, and then radiation as well. So as we face those things, it's kind of a daunting thing, when the doctor calls you and says, hey, got news for you. You do have cancer. It is life-threatening. Don't panic. The word order was a little bit reversed. It should be, don't panic. You do have cancer. It is.
By the time he got to don't panic, it was too late.
Yeah. So, we really addressed those things, went for the surgery, and then needed a time of recovery. So, Kathy?
I wanted to talk, in that time of being in Europe, the 16 years that we were in Frankfurt, about God's faithfulness. I remember when we went in 1988, I said to Marc, the 2 years that it took to get sent there, I said, will you promise me? And as I'm asking, we women know what we're doing. I knew that he couldn't promise me, but I said, would you promise me that you'll send me back to my family once a year at least. And of course, I knew the answer to that. There's no way that he could promise something like that. He didn't know the future. We didn't have just a flow of funds where, okay, plane fare's there, take off. And I knew that, but when we were finished with those 16 years and back in the U.S., I looked back over those 16 years and realized that for whatever reason, whether it was a crisis or whatever it was, that God made a way for me to be back, and I was back once a year.
Wow.
And so I think in talking about just the practical things that happen in our lives, that the Lord's faithfulness in getting us where we need to be and trusting Him. And I think that's a key to why we can say, God, we're ready to do whatever it is you want us to do, and we can go back to Vienna. And that's been now your grandparents. We have 3 fantastic sons and 3 daughters-in-law, and we have 5 grandbabies right now. And we adore them, of course, like grandparents do. And we would love to be near them physically and have enjoyed a number of years being closer to them. But we can say, Jesus, we will go if that's what you want us to do, because we know you will make a way. And even with Marc's cancer situation, we had meeting with some of our European friends in that time because they thought that the church found out Marc had cancer and they let him go. And we had to say, no, that is not how it happened. Actually, because of Marc's heart, he said, I just feel like this church needs someone else that can do a better job of shepherding them. And of course, as a wife, I'm concerned, of course, for them in my pastor's heart. But in my wife's heart, I'm saying, man, we've got to get him, some help and get him out of this situation. But we actually prayed and really sought God and made the decision at the end of the year honey, what was the year that we 2009? We said, this is what we need to do. So I think December of 2008, and we left, we stepped down, not physically, but we let everyone know that's what we were doing in January of 2009. And we made the decision for him to step down, and then I said, you need to go see all the physicians for the issues that you have. And then they found the cancer after we made the decision to step down. Mm-hmm. Not seeing the cancer and then stepping down. And what grace, and what a gracious God that He would lead us to making a decision by faith. He didn't have anything waiting in the wings, and we didn't know about the cancer. So we knew, because of the faithfulness of God and how He would care for us, that we could make a decision like that and trust Him for our next steps. So, gosh.
And the Lord, I didn't have faith to take a year sabbatical. Kathy had faith, I think, at first for 2 months, and then she extended that to 6. You tell the story.
Well, honey, it's just basically we didn't know about the cancer, and you just needed a break.
Yeah.
So then once we found out about the cancer, I said, okay, without a job, I can have faith for 6 months for Marc, because the supervisors were great. They asked me, what did I think? And in the end, it was 6 months, and our son stepped in, all 3 of them, and said, no, we believe Dad needs a year. And so I just said, okay, guys, if you believe he needs a year and you'll believe for a year, then I'll have my faith with yours, and we'll trust God for a year.
So yeah, and so I just said, okay, if you guys got faith for this, we'll see how it goes. And God just so provided. I mean, it was just wonderful. Friends, family, Foursquare United States stepped in big time. Our division of churches, district stepped in. Foursquare US stepped in and helped out. And Europe. Matter of fact, our friends in Europe, 50% of our support during that year came from friends in Europe, which incredible. Is similar to interesting when we declared again just recently that we felt God calling us back to Europe, and this time to Austria. The first people who heard about it without us even asking, the first people who wanted to give were 2 European churches that said, hey, we're going to take an offering and send it to you as a sign of our heart in Europe to have you back here. Oh, and before friends, family, anybody in the United States even gave a penny, two European churches raised finances to help us come.
That's amazing. That's great. Now, I want to wrap up the part about the cancer. How are you doing with that now? Just so everybody knows.
Yeah, 0 is a good number when you have PSA tests, and my numbers for 6 years have been 0. The one recently, to be honest, was 0.01 or 0.1 or 0.2, but the doctor said that's insignificant. It's still indetectable. That could have been just a blip in the test. So he said he's not concerned.
Praise God. Now let's explore for a few minutes Vienna and why Vienna.
Yeah, that's you know quite a bit about that story, Jeff, and we've talked about it for hours. So let's see if we can get a condensed version of that. A real quick answer to that was I needed to take a trip to Europe because Kathy had been the beginnings of the sense of returning to Europe. This time happened when Kathy was on a 5-week missions trip this past summer. Ministering in Europe, and God began to speak to her without me there about, hey, this is where you guys belong, just very, very strongly. And she was just convinced. She would stay up at night just planning and praying and making lists, and God moving on her heart. She shared that with me when she got back, and so I had this. Is the baby crying? Is that
no? That's quite all right. We're family friendly.
So,
Grandpa.
So what we had was her sharing that with me on the phone, and then not catching the full extent of it until she got back, and she was really ready to just start praying and packing suitcases and getting ready to go. And so my heart was to really pray that through a little bit more. I took a trip. I needed to take a trip and sense for myself, so I went to Germany, Bulgaria, and Croatia. Met with leaders there, met with pastor friends, talked, prayed, sensed some things. Had actually some invitations at that time for about 3 different places in Germany to come plant churches there. But there was no real spiritual ping involved. I love Germany, would move there in a heartbeat, but whatever we do, it has to be not just because we love it and have good memories and relationships. It really has to be the leading of the Lord. So I'm in Croatia, and the leader there and I are talking about it, how Vienna is so strategically located for East and West, and we could continue in our relational helping and encouraging of works that we help develop in Bulgaria and Croatia, and also very close to all of our family friends. We have daughter churches and granddaughter churches in Germany and in Austria. And while I'm there talking with him about Vienna as a place, Kathy met with you at the district conference in Portland and shared kind of her heart. And you said immediately, well, what about Berlin, which was one of the places we were offered to consider to come plant a church. And I just had felt, no, I'm really sure we're not to return to Berlin. She shared that with you, and you said, well, what about Vienna? And as soon as you said Vienna, something pinged in her heart. And she called me. And the fact that Nebajia and I had been talking about Vienna, and so we started discussing and researching Vienna, and it just grew from there. And confirmation after confirmation has just arisen, including a recent trip in January where we made another trip to Vienna, got boots on the ground, and to pray and to meet spiritual leaders there who some of them had known about our work, known about us and of our former work in Germany and our church in Frankfurt, and that we had daughter churches, and one in Austria, in Linz, Austria, and welcomed us with open hearts to come and join forces with them, praying for Vienna and Austria, and be in fellowship with them as a fellowship of pastors. And just some miraculous doors open for places for us to stay while we were there. And the present already existing pastors of our Foursquare Church in Linz were so enthusiastic and blessed and open-armed and encouraging for us to come. So there were pretty much a step after step, working with you and the Foursquare Executive Council, having kind of due diligence on some questions, and then coming to the conclusion that yes, we will invite you to come to Europe and focusing through Vienna on whatever God calls us to do. Mm-hmm. So that's the long story, very, very short.
Yeah. It's always hard to condense a life story into a sound clip, isn't it?
Incredible. I remember Marc asking me, one of the things when I came back from my trip in the summer, one of the things that we have to do is we pray about the direction of the Lord for this. We really have to know that we love the Viennese and the Austrians. And I said, well, let's see. We have some of our best friends in Frankfurt are from Austria, and the husband and also the brother of the husband are Viennese. And I started to name off their names, and their son and their daughter are just like our kids. And I said, there's Isabella, and there's Xander, and Camillo, and Felicia, and Johannes. I said, love. I guess we're good. We already had relationships with Austrians, and they're not that hard to love. They're pretty easy to love.
Yeah, and to make sure that that's the main motivation. Hey, not what will we do? Can we do something significant at this point in our life? And it really has to be motivated by this, this heart of God to reach people and to catch His heart for a people. And it really goes back to the origins of our DNA and this missional mentality to take the love of God to people way back from our experiences as young people. So when people ask us now, so what is your goal in Vienna? Is it you're going to plant a church, you're going to raise up leaders, you're going to have a school? Well, probably most of those things, but that's not the goal. The goal is transformed lives. The goal is reaching people with the love of Jesus Christ and this wonderful news of His love and His forgiveness and His acceptance and His healing power. And if God uses church planting to do that as a focal point and as a basis and a context, then hallelujah, that's the tool. And of course, for multiplication, raising up leaders and multiplying through leaders is always the biblical model for multiplication in the kingdom, but those things aren't the goal. The goal is to see Jesus reach lost people. He came to seek and save that which is lost, and so that's the goal. The others are steps to reach that goal.
What is your goal as far as getting there? When are you hoping to be on the ground?
Middle of October this year,
2015.
Yeah.
So coming up soon. So you probably don't need any support or finances or anything. You probably got everything lined up, right?
Wealthy.
Yeah, we've heard that's kind of an ambitious goal, but we actually as of Sunday we are now unemployed. We were on staff at Battleground Foursquare Church, but they've been really gracious to keep us on for a number of months, even after we've made this decision, knowing that we have to really focus now on raising funds, that they needed someone to take my job, which was substantial, lots of responsibilities. So they had to get somebody to replace me. So, we don't have a lot of time to mess around and be unemployed. And plus, because of our age, we don't want to wait a year or 2 years to go. We want to really strike while the iron is hot, and we're believing God to do that.
Yeah.
Some people say, well, that's just real. That's real soon. We don't know if you can raise the money that quick. But I don't think God's stock has gone down at all, and our passion for what the Lord's calling us to now really impacts our faith to believe for this. And when we ask people to invest in this kingdom project, it's not like asking people, hey, will you give us money? We want to live in Vienna, Austria.
Right.
The normal response to that would be, no, I'm not going to give you any money. I want to live in Vienna, Austria. So the idea is God's call to that strategic location, because Vienna it's bordered by 8 countries. 4 of those are former Eastern European countries, and the opportunities to be kingdom impacting in and through Vienna it's a great open door Eastern gateway. So as we share these things, we just with good confidence know to say, hey, we know you pray about where you invest your kingdom funds. This is what God has called us to do at this stage in our life, and we believe it's going to have some kingdom impact. Would you pray about God touching your heart to invest also in this mission? So it's really, we read this book, The God Ask. That's really what it is. Mm-hmm. It's asking people, will you ask God if this mission is supposed to be part of where you invest, and to be on our team and partner together with us as we reach Europeans through Vienna.
So if people wanted to connect with you, how would they do that?
Well, probably the best way right now, Jeff, is through email or Facebook. Mm-hmm. Marc Shaw or Kathy Shaw on Facebook. Marc Shaw is MarcShaw. And then email is the same, Marc, M-A-R-C, and then my middle name, Odare, O-D-A-R-E, Shaw, S-H-A-W, at gmail.com. So Marc Odare Shaw at gmail.com.
Great. We'll include links to these on the show notes. Odare, is that Irish or what?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there was this guy that was really nice to my mom when she was a little girl. I'm pretty sure his name was O'Dwyer. Okay. And my mom remembered it as Odare because there's no Irish name Odare, but there's lots of O'Dwyers.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, one more question for you before I let you go. I know you've got one of your grandkids there. We could hear a little bit in the background earlier. And being grandparents, being a grandparent myself, that's actually like music,
Yeah.
It's great. Being a grandparent's wonderful. It's like a do-over. You realize, oh, this is what I should have been doing back when I was young and had my own. Just relax and enjoy it and have fun with them.
But now you get to be the fun. Now you get to be the fun person and not the heavy.
Exactly. Hey, one more question for each of you. If I had a time machine and I was able to take you back to your 25-year-old self, what advice would you give yourself?
Wow. I'm having a hard time remembering when I was 25.
I think I would give myself quite a bit of advice, Jeff, but I don't think I would have listened to me.
True that.
My advice would have been, don't be so anxious about things. It really is in God's hand. If you've put it there and you've prayed and you've trusted Him with it, don't be anxious about it. Or if people don't understand you, or if they oppose you, don't lose sleep over it. Don't be anxious about it. If someone, one of the great things that hit me later in my experience was this incredible love of God, and to tell my 25-year-old self, hey, get a revelation of God's love that anchors you so deep in security in His heart. But the story of Jesus when He was betrayed by Judas, and Jesus looks at Judas and says, what do you want, friend? Mm-hmm. He knows he's being betrayed by Judas. Nothing hurts more than being betrayed by somebody that you trust and love. And emotional devastation of that is just immense. But from Jesus' heart, He didn't let Judas's choice or attitude impact His heart and His attitude. He said, you just keep a pure heart before God and love. And let that be your direction. Let it be your path. Let it be your light. And God will take care of you. I don't know if my 25-year-old self would have listened to that.
How about you, Kathy?
Oh, I think when I look back and remember, how much energy you have when you're 25 years of age, and yet you are insecure. You haven't found that place of rest yet in who God made you to be, and good thing you're busy with a lot of things. When I was 25, I was probably pregnant with our second child, and I think we spent a lot of time thinking about what we will be or what we will be doing or what is God doing with me? Is he going to use my life? And maybe oftentimes dissatisfied with where we are at. Although I remember for me personally, my highest calling was to be a wife and a mother. I loved being a mother. I even loved having babies. It's pretty weird, I know, but I just couldn't imagine anything more wonderful. And it even went with the times when it's not so much fun. But I think thinking about the future and maybe not being satisfied because of that insecurity. And it's naive to think that at that age we're going to have a level of trust and understanding, again, of what I said in the beginning about knowing really who God is and that he is so trustworthy and faithful, and then yet understanding who you are and the gifts and just learning to love God and love yourself in a deeper way. It's naive to think at 25 you're going to have that understanding when you're 65.
Right.
But at the same time, I think it's similar to what Marc said. Kind of my personality. Probably I was really hard on myself and a very busy and very a perfectionist who loved to do things and do them well. To be able to relax and know that we used to say, God loves you. He'll never love you more than he loves you now. And when he gave his life for you, he loved you as much then. And be able to rest in that fact. And now I can see that I didn't have to do anything to please him or be more loved by him, but he loved me just because I was his daughter, the Father loving me, and because I was Jesus' a friend and sister, so a child of God. So I think if I would have been able to talk with myself, I would have tried to talk to me about that, of letting go and relaxing, about trusting God for the future and for who you are right now. And yet at the same time, because you're so excited about the future, realizing that, that old adage, live in the now, that you really did live in the now and were excited and were able to let go of what the future held because you knew how trustworthy God was. So probably along those lines.
Oh, that's great. Well, I sure do appreciate having you guys on the podcast today, and hopefully some people out there have been listening to you and kind of caught your heart for what God is going to do with you as you partner with him and what he's already doing in Vienna and beyond, and they'll reach out and connect with you guys. God bless you.
Jeff, thanks, and bless you in all of your immense responsibilities that you carry.
Thank you, my friends. Well, we're done now. Thanks for listening. This is Jeff Roper reminding you that the mission of God is too grand for mediocrity or average living. You were created for a purpose, and that purpose is found in the mission of God. It's your life. Now go live it.